For most of his life, Charles Weston had been a man who preferred silence over noise, restraint over indulgence, and order over chaos. His career as a federal judge had taught him the value of control, not just in the courtroom, where tempers flared and lives hung in the balance of his rulings, but in his personal life, where he valued calmness above all else. He was known across the legal community as unshakable, the kind of judge who could preside over the most volatile cases without raising his voice. Attorneys feared facing him, criminals dreaded his rulings, and even fellow judges often admitted they would never want to stand on the wrong side of his gavel. But outside of his robe, Charles looked like any other aging man living in rural America. He wore simple jeans, flannel shirts, and kept his white hair trimmed. He moved into the countryside not to flaunt his position, but to disappear from it. The property he purchased years earlier was a wide expanse of farmland, rolling acres, dotted with cornfields and framed by old oak trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. At the edge of the land stood a rustic barn, painted a faded red, weathered from decades of storms and seasons. It wasn't much, but to Charles it was perfect. It was quiet, useful, and symbolic of the roots he had planted outside the courtroom. He used the barn not only to store equipment and supplies, but also as a personal retreat. Inside, there were shelves filled with law books he no longer referenced, stacks of journals filled with handwritten notes, and even a small corner where he built wooden furniture in his spare time. To him, that barn wasn't just a storage unit. It was a piece of his soul, but peace, as Charles had learned both in law and in life, was rarely permanent. Trouble had a way of creeping into quiet places, disguised at first as something manageable until it revealed its true form. The trouble in this case came in the form of the homeowners association. Charles's land had technically fallen within the outer boundary of a suburban development created years after he purchased it. Developers had carved up plots around his farmland, building neat rows of houses with identical driveways, manicured lawns, and strict HOA rules. At first, Charles ignored them. He had owned his property long before the development existed, and he assumed the HOA had no authority over him. But as time went on, letters began arriving in his mailbox, complaints about his barn, about his cornfields, about the unsuburban look of his land. The HOA wanted uniformity, but Charles's land was anything but uniform. At the center of these letters was one name that became more irritating with every passing week: Karen Lancaster. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a woman whose entire identity seemed to revolve around the illusion of power. Karen was infamous in the neighborhood. She patrolled the streets daily, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of trash cans left out too long, grass that grew an inch too high, or fences painted the wrong shade of beige. Neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors, but rarely challenged her openly. She was relentless, manipulative, and had a talent for turning petty complaints into full-blown conflicts. Charles, however, was not the kind of man who could be intimidated. He read the letters, scoffed at them, and tucked them away in a drawer. He believed, perhaps naively, that ignoring Karen would make her go away. But Karen thrived on resistance. The more Charles ignored her, the more determined she became. The barn, in particular, became her obsession. Karen called it an eyesore. She insisted it violated the HOA's aesthetic harmony. She even accused Charles of running a commercial operation out of it, which was strictly against the association's rules. None of it was true, of course, but that didn't matter. Karen wasn't after truth. She was after submission. Charles could see where this was heading. He had dealt with people like Karen in the courtroom many times before. People who twisted rules to suit their own desires, who abused authority because they thought no one could stop them. People who mistook stubbornness for power. He knew the type well, and he knew how dangerous they could be if left unchecked. Still, he made the conscious choice not to engage. He had sentenced men to life in prison for less provocation, yet here he was, calmly tending to his cornfields while Karen scribbled angry notes about his barn. But the situation escalated. Karen didn't just send letters anymore. She started gathering other HOA members, rallying them against him, painting him as the stubborn old man who refused to follow the rules. Soon, Charles noticed more than just Karen staring at his property. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed, whispering to one another, some nodding in agreement with Karen's mission, others shaking their heads in pity. The divide was forming, and Charles was at the center of it. It would have remained a petty feud, just another battle in the endless war between HOAs and homeowners, if not for one catastrophic event. One evening, after a long day in court, Charles returned home to find smoke rising from his property. His heart sank as he pulled into the long dirt driveway, the acrid smell of burning wood filling the air. His barn, the one place he treasured more than any other, was engulfed in flames. Fire crews were already on the scene, but the structure was too far gone. The flames roared like a beast, consuming everything inside, reducing his personal retreat, his storage, and his memories into ash. Charles stood silently as the barn collapsed in on itself, the fire devouring it whole. By the time the fire was out, all that remained was a blackened skeleton of wood and twisted metal. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the property, some gasping in shock, others whispering. And in the crowd, Charles saw Karen. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shocked. She was smiling, as though watching the barn burn was some kind of personal victory. That was the moment Charles knew this was no accident. The fire department called it undetermined in origin, but Charles had presided over arson cases before. He knew the signs. He knew when something was deliberate. And he knew, deep in his bones, who was responsible. Karen had taken the feud to an unforgivable level. For the first time in years, Charles felt the old fire rise within him, the same fire that once fueled his most merciless rulings in court. But this time, it wasn't a case file on his desk or a defendant standing before him. This time, it was personal. Karen Lancaster thought she was untouchable. She thought Charles was just another retiree, too weak and too quiet to fight back. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. Charles Weston was not just a homeowner with a barn, he was a federal judge, and now he was going to make Karen regret everything. Charles Weston had seen hundreds of faces in his courtroom over the decades, faces twisted with arrogance, desperation, defiance, or shame. He had witnessed hardened criminals attempt to outsmart him, wealthy executives try to bribe him, and cunning lawyers stretch the truth until it snapped. Each time, Charles had been unflinching, unmoved, and utterly relentless. But nothing in his long career had ever stoked his anger in the way the sight of his burning barn had. The barn was not just wood and nails. It was the symbol of everything he had built for himself outside the suffocating world of law. It was his sanctuary, his retreat, his reminder that even the most feared judge in the federal system could still be a simple man who loved cornfields and quiet. And now, that symbol was gone, reduced to smoldering ash by the pettiness of a woman who believed her clipboard carried more authority than the Constitution itself. Karen Lancaster had crossed a line. In the days following the fire, Charles kept to himself, walking the charred ruins of what was once his barn, silently cataloging every item that had been destroyed. His woodworking tools melted and blackened, the journals he had filled over decades, gone in a flash of smoke. The law books, once neatly stacked in rows, now fused together into unrecognizable lumps of ash. Each discovery felt like a personal wound, a deliberate theft not of property, but of memory and peace. The fire marshal's report was inconclusive, at least officially. The barn was too far gone for definitive proof. But Charles had presided over enough arson cases to know what accelerant looked like. He had seen how quickly the flames spread, unnaturally fast for an old barn filled with nothing but corn feed and wood. He noted the strange burn patterns, the way the fire seemed to originate from more than one point. This was no accident of faulty wiring or careless storage. This was a fire born of intent, and intent had a face. Karen's smug smile the night of the fire was seared into his mind. While others had gasped in sympathy, she had looked almost triumphant. She hadn't even tried to hide it. To her, the destruction of his barn wasn't tragedy. It was conquest. But Karen had made one critical mistake. She thought Charles Weston was just another homeowner, an elderly man who would be too overwhelmed, too powerless to fight back. She thought his silence meant weakness. She had no idea who she was dealing with. For years, Charles had cultivated anonymity outside the courtroom. His neighbors knew him as the quiet man at the edge of the development. They knew little about his career, and he preferred it that way. He had no interest in boasting about his position, no desire to inject his professional power into his personal life. But now he realized that anonymity had emboldened Karen. She saw him as a target, not a threat. That was about to change. The first step in Charles's plan was patience. He had spent his life mastering the art of restraint, never acting impulsively, always gathering facts before delivering judgment. This situation would be no different. Though his instincts screamed for immediate retaliation, he reminded himself that the most devastating consequences were those delivered with precision. He began by reviewing every HOA letter Karen had ever sent him. He had saved them all, tucking them away in a desk drawer, dismissing them as nuisances at the time. Now, as he spread them across his kitchen table, they looked different. They looked like evidence. He noted the language she used, phrases that bordered on harassment, threats disguised as warnings, demands that had no legal basis. Each letter painted a picture of obsession, a campaign designed to break him down. Next, he reached out quietly to a few neighbors, not with confrontation, but with conversation. He had learned long ago that people often revealed the most when they didn't realize they were being questioned. Over casual chats, he asked how they felt about the HOA, about Karen, about the way rules were enforced. What he discovered only confirmed what he already suspected. Karen had been terrorizing the entire neighborhood for years. Families admitted they lived in constant fear of her clipboard patrols. One man confessed he had received fines for leaving his child's bicycle on the lawn overnight. Another said Karen had demanded he repaint his front door 3 times because the shade of blue wasn't community approved. Elderly residents admitted they paid fines not because they were guilty of violations, but because they were too tired to argue. Karen ruled the neighborhood through intimidation, and most had simply surrendered to it. But Charles was no ordinary neighbor. He spent his evenings drafting documents, pulling case law, and building a file thicker than any Karen had ever seen. He wasn't just preparing to defend himself, he was preparing to dismantle her. Slowly, methodically, he gathered proof not only of her harassment, but of her financial misconduct. HOA records, which were supposed to be transparent, told a story of misused funds, suspicious expenses, and fees that seemed to vanish without explanation. The deeper he dug, the more he uncovered. Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant with a clipboard, she was corrupt. Charles knew the law better than anyone. He understood that while neighbors could grumble and gossip about Karen's behavior, few could challenge her without risking retaliation. But he also knew that corruption and arson, once exposed, could destroy not just reputations, but lives. Still, Charles had no intention of storming into an HOA meeting and revealing his hand. That wasn't his style. A judge knew the power of timing, of building suspense, of letting an adversary feel secure before striking the final blow. Karen would not see it coming until it was too late. For now, he let her think she had won. Karen grew bolder in the weeks after the fire. She strutted through the neighborhood with renewed arrogance, boasting that problem properties would be dealt with, bragging about her influence over the HOA board. Some neighbors whispered that she had finally broken the quiet man at the edge of the development. After all, he hadn't replaced the barn yet. He hadn't confronted her. He hadn't said a word, and that silence made Karen careless. She began to push further, sending Charles new letters demanding that he remove the charred remains of the barn immediately, threatening him with daily fines until it was cleared. She claimed the sight of the burned structure lowered community values, even though everyone knew she had likely caused it. She even suggested that his farmland be rezoned to match the suburban lots around it, effectively stripping him of his privacy and independence. Each letter, each demand, each smug smirk she flashed while walking past his property only added fuel to the fire burning inside Charles. She believed she was tightening the noose around his neck. What she didn't realize was that she was building the very case that would undo her. Late one night, Charles stood on the edge of his field, staring at the ruins of his barn under the pale light of the moon. The smell of ash still lingered in the air, faint but sharp, like the echo of a wound that hadn't healed. He clenched his fists, not in frustration but in resolve. Karen thought she had destroyed him. But Charles Weston was not the kind of man who could be destroyed by fire. He had stared down cartel leaders, mob bosses, and corporate giants in his courtroom. He had delivered sentences that shook entire industries. And now he was turning that same unrelenting force onto Karen Lancaster. The barn may have been gone, but the judge remained. And soon the neighborhood would see exactly who their quiet neighbor truly was. Charles Weston had always believed that justice was not confined to the courtroom. The law, in its truest form, lived in every corner of society, on city streets, in corporate boardrooms, and even in quiet suburban neighborhoods where fences and driveways became battlegrounds. And now, standing amidst the blackened skeleton of his barn, Charles felt that truth more strongly than ever. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was justice demanding to be served, and he was the man destined to deliver it. For weeks, Charles had remained outwardly passive, allowing Karen Lancaster to bask in what she thought was her victory. To the untrained eye, he was a man defeated, his barn destroyed, his land scarred, his silence signaling surrender. But beneath that silence was calculation. Years on the bench had taught him that the strongest case was built not in haste, but in patience. Let the other side reveal their hand. Let them grow overconfident. And when the moment was right, strike with precision. Karen made his job easy. The aftermath of the fire seemed to embolden her. She walked the neighborhood like a queen surveying her kingdom, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning for the smallest of infractions. Neighbors who had once cowered now began to avoid her altogether, slipping inside their homes at the sight of her car, whispering her name like she was some kind of suburban curse. Yet Karen thrived on their fear. Each new complaint she filed, each fine she imposed, seemed to fuel her ego. But she reserved her sharpest arrows for Charles. Within days of the fire, he received a letter demanding that the remains of the barn be removed within 72 hours. Failure to comply, she wrote, would result in fines of $500 per day. The language was heavy-handed, almost theatrical in its cruelty. Charles recognized it for what it was: harassment dressed as regulation. He didn't respond. Then came another letter, this one claiming that his farmland, with its rows of corn and weathered fencing, violated community standards of visual uniformity. She insisted he either rezone the property or face legal action from the HOA. Again, he said nothing, and finally, the boldest strike yet. Karen announced in a neighborhood meeting that she would be introducing a motion to have Charles's property forcibly annexed into the HOA's jurisdiction, stripping him of his rights as a pre-existing landowner. To her, the barn fire was just the beginning. Her real prize was total control. Charles listened from the back of the meeting, his expression unreadable. If Karen had known who he truly was, she might have reconsidered speaking so brazenly in front of him. But she didn't. She saw only an aging man with dirt under his nails and ashes on his boots, not the federal judge whose rulings had shaped industries and toppled criminal empires, and that was exactly how Charles wanted it, because what Karen didn't know was that Charles was already turning the neighborhood into his courtroom. He began with evidence. Every letter Karen had sent him was meticulously cataloged, not as mere correspondence, but as exhibits in a growing case file. He noted dates, times, and wording, highlighting passages that revealed harassment, overreach, and threats beyond the HOA's authority. He paired them with photographs of the barn ruins, testimony from neighbors who had witnessed Karen near his property the night of the fire, and financial records he had quietly acquired from the HOA's filings. The deeper he dug into the HOA's finances, the more rot he uncovered. Karen had been skimming from the association's budget for years. Landscaping projects that were never completed, maintenance fees that had no receipts, administrative expenses that funneled into her personal bank account. Charles traced the paper trail with the precision of a surgeon, following each dollar until the picture became undeniable. Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was a thief. But Charles knew that evidence alone wasn't enough. The law wasn't just about facts. It was about narrative. It was about building a story so compelling that even the most skeptical listener couldn't deny its truth. And so he began weaving the strands together into a tapestry of corruption and abuse. Karen believed she controlled the neighborhood. Soon, Charles would make the neighborhood see the truth. The turning point came at the next HOA meeting. It was held, as always, in the community clubhouse, a sterile, beige-walled building with fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. Residents gathered in folding chairs, clutching coffee cups, their faces etched with fatigue. For most, these meetings were a monthly exercise in endurance, a chance to nod silently while Karen dominated the agenda with her endless list of grievances. But this meeting would be different. Karen opened, as she always did, with a self-satisfied smile and a stack of papers clipped together. She rattled off minor infractions, trash bins left out too long, hedges trimmed unevenly, before landing on her favorite subject, Charles Weston. She announced, with mock gravity, that his property had become a blight on the neighborhood, citing the burned remains of the barn as evidence. She proposed immediate action to seize control of his land under HOA jurisdiction. Gasps rippled through the room. Even those who feared Karen recognized the audacity of her demand. To strip a man of his property rights was no small thing. Yet Karen carried on as though it were inevitable, her tone dripping with authority, and then slowly, Charles rose from his chair. The room fell silent. For years, most residents had seen him as little more than a recluse, a quiet old man who kept to himself on his farmland. But as he walked to the front of the room, his presence seemed to shift the air. His posture was firm, his steps deliberate, his gaze unyielding. He didn't need a robe or a gavel. He carried authority in every movement, the kind born not of bluster but of decades commanding order in federal courts. He placed a thick binder on the table, its weight echoing through the room, and then, in a calm, steady voice, he began to speak. He outlined the harassment he had endured, the letters, the fines, the threats. He detailed the corruption he had uncovered in the HOA's finances, pointing to specific line items that bore Karen's signature. He presented witness statements, financial records, and photographs, each piece building upon the last like bricks in a fortress. The residents watched, wide-eyed, as the quiet neighbor they had underestimated transformed before their eyes into something else entirely. He wasn't just defending himself, he was prosecuting Karen. And then, with measured force, he revealed the truth of who he was. He was not just Charles Weston, farmer and neighbor. He was Judge Charles Weston, federal authority, a man whose rulings carried the weight of the United States government. His silence had not been weakness. It had been patience. His restraint had not been surrender. It had been strategy. The room erupted in whispers. Some gasped in shock, others exchanged knowing looks as if the pieces had finally clicked into place. Suddenly, the quiet man at the edge of the neighborhood was no longer an anonymous retiree. He was power incarnate. Karen's face drained of color. The smug confidence she had worn like armor crumbled in an instant. She tried to interject, to dismiss his claims as exaggeration, but Charles had anticipated every move. Each protest she made, he countered with irrefutable proof. Each denial she voiced, he silenced with cold, hard evidence. By the time he was finished, the room no longer looked at Karen as their leader. They looked at her as a criminal, and Karen knew it. For the first time in years, she was no longer in control. That night marked the beginning of Karen's downfall. The neighbors who once cowered under her authority now saw her for what she truly was, a manipulator, a thief, and possibly even an arsonist. Whispers turned to open rebellion. Board members who had once rubber-stamped her demands now distanced themselves, fearful of being dragged down with her. But Charles wasn't finished. He knew the courtroom wasn't just a place, it was a state of mind. And now he had brought it to the neighborhood. The trial of Karen Lancaster had begun, and though no jury sat in judgment, the weight of truth was already tipping the scales. And as Charles closed his binder that night, watching Karen squirm in her chair, he felt something he hadn't in years. Not anger, not satisfaction, but justice. Still, justice was rarely complete with a single strike, because Karen Lancaster, as cornered as she now was, had one thing left to cling to: desperation. And desperate people were always dangerous. For a woman like Karen Lancaster, control was not just a luxury, it was oxygen. She thrived on the ability to bend others to her will, to see neighbors shrink beneath her stare, to hear the hushed compliance that followed her threats. For years, she had built her little empire within the subdivision, brick by brick, rule by rule, until no one dared challenge her authority. But now, with one binder slammed on a clubhouse table, that empire had begun to crumble. Charles Weston's revelation of who he truly was, a federal judge with decades of rulings behind him, had stripped Karen of the armor she had worn for so long. No longer was she the unchallenged queen of the neighborhood. No longer did her words carry unchallenged authority. Instead, whispers followed her now, whispers of fraud, theft, and worse. Neighbors who once cowered in silence crossed the street to avoid her. Board members who once nodded eagerly at her demands now exchanged wary glances, their loyalty shaken. And Karen, for the first time, was cornered. But desperation breeds recklessness. And Karen Lancaster, stripped of her power, was about to lash out in ways that would drag the neighborhood into chaos. The days after the meeting were a study in contrasts. For Charles, there was quiet progress. He received nods of respect from neighbors who had once barely acknowledged his presence. Families stopped by his property to thank him, cautiously at first, then more openly, for standing up to Karen in a way none of them had dared. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt a crack of light breaking through the suffocating cloud of Karen's rule. But for Karen, the days were filled with unraveling. She stormed through the neighborhood with even more aggression than before. Clipboard in hand, her eyes wild, her tone sharper. Where once her patrols were met with nervous obedience, now they drew sighs, rolled eyes, and quiet defiance. When she confronted a young couple about the color of their shutters, they laughed in her face. When she wrote up a violation for a lawn ornament, the homeowner crumpled the notice and tossed it at her feet. Each rejection was another fracture in her crumbling authority. And each fracture deepened her rage. And then, late one night, as Charles walked the edge of his field, beneath the pale glow of the moon, he sensed he was being watched. He turned, scanning the tree line, and for just a moment caught sight of a figure, a woman's silhouette, slipping away into the shadows. He knew it was Karen. She was no longer content to fight with letters and fines. She had shifted to something darker. The first real strike came the following week. Charles woke one morning to find his cornfield vandalized. Dozens of stalks had been slashed to the ground, cut cleanly as if by a blade. The destruction was methodical, a cruel act designed not for theft or utility, but for punishment. The field, once a proud expanse of green, now bore ugly scars of Karen's anger. Neighbors whispered that teenagers might have done it, but Charles knew better. The clean cuts, the targeted destruction, it was deliberate. It was a message. Karen had escalated the war. Charles did not react with visible fury. Instead, he documented everything, taking photographs, noting patterns, cataloging it all. Each act of destruction was not just cruelty, it was evidence. He had spent his life teaching others that the law was patient, that it didn't need to shout to be heard. And so he let Karen dig her own grave, one reckless act at a time. But Karen wasn't finished. When vandalism failed to rattle him, she turned to rumor. She whispered to neighbors that Charles was dangerous, that he was abusing his authority, that his binder of evidence was fabricated to make her look bad. She painted herself as the victim, the lone woman being persecuted by a powerful man. She even hinted that Charles's quiet demeanor was sinister, that he had secrets no one could imagine. Some neighbors, out of habit, listened. But more and more the whispers rang hollow. They had seen Karen's corruption exposed. They had witnessed her smile at the burning barn. They knew where the truth lay, yet Karen's desperation only deepened. One night, Charles returned home from the courthouse to find something waiting for him on his doorstep. A dead crow, its wings spread, its body stiff. It was a grotesque warning, a message written not in ink, but in malice. Charles stared at it silently, his expression unreadable, before carefully bagging it and placing it in his evidence file. Karen had shifted from harassment to intimidation, and in doing so, she had crossed yet another line. For Charles, this was no longer just about personal justice. It was about protecting a community from someone who believed rules were weapons. Karen's reign of terror had gone unchecked for too long, and now her desperation made her dangerous, not only to him, but to everyone around her. So Charles began to prepare, not just for legal action, but for confrontation. The climax of Karen's desperation came at the next HOA board meeting. By then, the air in the neighborhood had shifted. What was once submission had become defiance. Residents arrived not with timid expressions, but with simmering frustration, ready to voice grievances that had been bottled up for years. The room was packed, the tension electric. Karen, however, stormed in with her usual arrogance, clutching her clipboard like a shield. She took her seat at the head of the table, glaring at Charles across the room, her smile brittle, her eyes full of venom. The meeting began with routine matters, but it wasn't long before Karen made her move. She accused Charles of orchestrating a witch hunt against her, of using his position to intimidate and manipulate the community. She waved her arms, her voice rising, her words dripping with venom. She painted herself as the last defender of community standards, the lone warrior standing against chaos. But this time, no one clapped. Instead, voices rose from the crowd, voices of neighbors who had been silenced for too long. They spoke of unfair fines, of harassment, of fear. They accused Karen of corruption, of intimidation, of lies. One by one, they dismantled her story until her words echoed hollow against the walls. And then Charles stood. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply presented the facts, calmly, clearly, methodically. He laid out the evidence of Karen's corruption, her misuse of funds, her harassment, her escalation into vandalism and intimidation. He spoke not as a man seeking vengeance, but as a judge delivering truth. The room listened in silence, every word landing like a gavel strike. By the time he finished, Karen's empire was gone, but Karen was not a woman who surrendered gracefully. As the board voted to suspend her authority pending investigation, she erupted. She screamed, she cursed, she threatened lawsuits and revenge. She pointed a trembling finger at Charles, vowing that he would regret ever crossing her. Security had to escort her from the building as neighbors watched in stunned silence, and as the clubhouse door slammed behind her, the neighborhood exhaled for the first time in years. But Charles did not exhale, because he knew something the others didn't. Karen was not finished. She was cornered, humiliated, stripped of her power. And for a woman like Karen, that meant only one thing. War was far from over. And Charles, standing tall at the back of the room, knew he had to be ready. Because desperate people were dangerous, and Karen Lancaster was about to prove just how dangerous she could be. Humiliation is a poison. For some, it is a temporary sting, something that fades with time. But for Karen Lancaster, humiliation was intolerable. It gnawed at her, consumed her, twisted her mind into darker shapes. The HOA meeting that had once been her stage of dominance had ended with her being dragged out, her power stripped, her neighbors staring not in obedience but in disgust. The queen had been dethroned, and the fall was more than her pride could handle. For Charles Weston, the fallout from that night was steady and predictable. Neighbors who had once avoided his gaze now stopped to shake his hand, to thank him for standing up to Karen. The board moved quickly, launching a full audit of HOA finances. Committees were formed to review bylaws and to reclaim authority that had long been ceded to Karen's iron grip. For the first time in years, the neighborhood seemed to breathe freely. But Charles knew peace was fragile, because Karen had disappeared into silence. and silence from someone like her was never a good sign. At first, the quiet was almost unsettling. Days passed with no new violation letters, no threats, no angry patrols. The clipboard that had once been an extension of Karen's arm seemed to vanish entirely. Some neighbors dared to hope it was over, that Karen had finally been broken, that she had slunk away into bitter obscurity. But Charles had seen too much of human nature to believe it. He had watched defendants stand silently in court, their faces masks of calm, only to erupt into violence when the gavel fell. Silence was not surrender. Silence was plotting. And soon, the signs began to appear. One morning, Charles found tire tracks cutting across the edge of his property, deep ruts carved into the soil near the ruins of his barn. Another day, his mailbox was smashed open, the letters inside scattered like confetti across the road. On yet another morning, he discovered crude graffiti spray-painted on his fence, words scrawled in red, crude insults meant to rattle him. But Charles was not a man who rattled easily. Each incident was carefully photographed, logged, and added to the growing file he kept on Karen. If she wanted to escalate, he would let her. But he would also make sure every step she took dug her hole deeper. Still, Charles knew this was only the beginning. Karen was unraveling. The true escalation came under the cover of night. Charles awoke to the smell of smoke, sharp, acrid, invasive. He bolted upright, instincts sharpened by years of recognizing danger in an instant. Outside his window, a faint orange glow flickered against the trees. He rushed outside, his heart steady but his pace urgent. At the edge of his field, he saw it. Fire. Small at first, a controlled blaze, but spreading quickly through the dry stalks of corn. The night air filled with crackling, the flames hungry. Licking upward with alarming speed. Someone had set his field on fire. Charles grabbed a hose. Dousing the nearest flames, his movements precise, methodical. He called the fire department, his voice calm but firm, directing them to the scene. Within minutes, engines arrived, their lights cutting through the darkness as firefighters battled the spreading blaze. The damage, though contained, was unmistakable. An entire section of his crop was destroyed. The air reeked of smoke and scorched earth, and standing at the edge of the gathered crowd, illuminated by flashing lights, was Karen Lancaster. She didn't smile this time. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough. Charles met her eyes across the chaos, and in that moment, no words were needed. He knew. She knew he knew. This was no longer a petty feud. This was war. The next days brought a new atmosphere to the neighborhood. Fear crept back into the air, thicker now, sharper. Neighbors whispered about the fire, about Karen, about how far she might go. Some avoided her altogether, others locked their doors at night, uncertain of what desperation might drive her to next. But Charles did not cower. Instead, he prepared. He fortified his evidence file, adding reports from the fire department, witness statements, photographs of the damage. He reached out quietly to contacts from his years on the bench, detectives, attorneys, investigators. He didn't ask for favors. He didn't need to. He simply let them know he was building something, and that when the time came, he would need them ready. Karen, meanwhile, grew wilder. She shouted at neighbors in the street, accused them of betrayal, left venomous voicemails for board members. Her composure was gone, replaced by raw fury. She drove through the neighborhood at odd hours, circling like a predator. Her car lights sweeping across windows in the dead of night. She was losing control, and everyone could see it. Everyone except Karen herself. But Karen's rage had one final act left. Charles returned home one evening to find his farmhouse door ajar. His heart didn't race, but his senses sharpened, his hand tightening on the flashlight he carried. He stepped inside, scanning each room carefully. Nothing seemed stolen, nothing obviously damaged, until he reached his study, the file, the binder he had meticulously built. The evidence against Karen was gone. In its place, on his desk, sat a single sheet of paper. A handwritten note, scrawled in jagged lines, "Stop, or next time it's not just the barn, Charles stared at the note for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, calmly, he folded it, placed it in a plastic sleeve, and added it to a new binder he had already begun, because Karen's theft wasn't a victory. It was more evidence. She had broken into his home. She had crossed a line so bold, so undeniable, that there would be no coming back. Charles didn't rage. He didn't shout. He simply made a decision. It was time to end this. The neighborhood felt the shift. Word spread quickly about the break-in, about the fire, about the escalating madness of Karen Lancaster. Neighbors who once avoided conflict began to whisper about police involvement, about restraining orders, about whether Karen would finally face consequences. The once fractured community now found common cause. They wanted Karen gone, and Charles, though he didn't show it outwardly, felt the same fire burning within. Not the fire that had destroyed his barn or his cornfield, but the fire of justice. Karen had played her hand recklessly. She had escalated from harassment to destruction to outright threats, and in doing so, she had built the strongest case against herself. Charles knew that when the gavel finally fell, it would fall hard. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of crimson, Charles stood once more at the ruins of his barn. The air was still, the world hushed, as if waiting. Karen thought she had broken him with fire. But fire only hardened steel, and Charles Weston was steel. The next move would not be hers. It would be his, and when it came, it would not be another skirmish, another clash in their feud. It would be final, because the war was nearly over, and the judge was ready to deliver his verdict. There is a moment in every battle where the tide shifts for good. A moment where one side realizes the fight is no longer winnable, where desperation collides with inevitability. For Karen Lancaster, that moment had already passed. She just didn't know it yet. For Charles Weston, it arrived the night he sat alone in his farmhouse study, staring at the note Karen had left on his desk. "Stop, or next time it's not just the barn." The words weren't just a threat, they were a confession. A woman consumed by her own spite had written her guilt into existence. Charles had spent his life on the bench, weighing the scales of justice. He had always believed in patience, in procedure, in letting the law run its course. But this wasn't a courtroom. This was his home, his life, his land. And now, Karen had forced his hand. The judge was ready to render his verdict. The following days were marked by a calm unlike anything the neighborhood had experienced in years. Not because Karen had quieted. Her rampages were louder than ever. She stormed through board meetings she was no longer invited to, stood outside neighbors' homes screaming accusations, and even drove slowly past Charles's farmhouse, her headlights flooding his windows like searchlights. But Charles didn't respond. Not with words, not with confrontation, not with even the smallest acknowledgement, because Charles knew something Karen did not. The walls were closing in. Behind the scenes, he had set everything in motion. The local police, long wary of Karen's ability to spin narratives and create chaos, had been hesitant to intervene before. But now, with documented arson, break-ins, threats, vandalism, and a binder full of evidence Karen hadn't managed to steal, they were beginning to see the truth. Charles had quietly given them everything: photographs, reports, statements, timestamps. It was airtight. Still, Charles knew better than to rush. Timing was everything in law and in life. So he waited. The trap was sprung on a Sunday morning. The neighborhood was quiet, families trickling to church or settling into their weekend routines. Charles sat on his porch, sipping coffee, the early sun casting golden light across his fields. He looked calm, almost serene. Karen, however, was anything but. She appeared at the edge of his property, clipboard in hand once more, her posture rigid with manufactured authority. To the untrained eye, it looked like just another HOA patrol. But Charles recognized the desperate edge in her eyes, the twitch of someone who knew control was slipping away. She strode up his driveway, shouting accusations about code violations, about illegal crops, about how she would bring the full weight of the HOA down on him. But this time there was no audience to intimidate. No board to manipulate, no power to wield. Because as she raged at Charles, 2 police cruisers rolled up the road, lights flashing silently. They pulled into the drive, officers stepping out with purposeful calm. The sight made Karen freeze, her words catching in her throat. The officers approached, asking her to step aside. And when they read her the charges, arson, trespassing, harassment, destruction of property, Karen's face twisted with disbelief. "No!" she screamed. "This is wrong! He's lying! He's manipulating all of you!" But her words fell flat, because for once, the neighborhood wasn't watching with fear. They were watching with relief. Neighbors stood on porches, peeking through curtains, their eyes wide as Karen was handcuffed and led to the cruiser. Years of tyranny, years of intimidation, ended not with a bang, but with the cold, quiet click of metal on wrists. Charles didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stood, coffee still in hand, watching as justice finally arrived at his doorstep. The feared federal judge hadn't needed to raise his voice. He had let the law speak for him, but the story didn't end with Karen's arrest. Court proceedings followed swiftly, thanks in part to the airtight evidence Charles had compiled. Neighbors who had once cowered now came forward, testifying to her years of harassment. The board revealed financial mismanagement under her leadership. Fire investigators confirmed the blaze on Charles's property had been intentionally set. Piece by piece, the facade Karen had built crumbled. Her reputation, once ironclad in the neighborhood, disintegrated under the weight of facts and testimony. The courtroom was packed during her trial, not because the charges were unusual, but because the spectacle was irresistible. To see the woman who had lorded over them, who had controlled them with fear, now seated at the defendant's table, it was poetic. Charles attended every session, sitting silently, his presence alone a reminder of the balance she had upset. He didn't need to testify loudly or dramatically. The evidence spoke louder than either of them could, and when the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts, the neighborhood exhaled as one. Karen Lancaster was sentenced not just to fines and restitution, but to time behind bars. The queen of the HOA was dethroned, not by rebellion, not by violence, but by the steady, unshakable hand of justice. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Without Karen's grip, the board restructured itself, giving homeowners more say in decisions. Rules were enforced fairly, violations handled with respect rather than cruelty. Neighbors who had once lived in silence began to connect, to share meals, to build the kind of community they had always wanted. Charles's farmhouse became a quiet landmark in this reborn neighborhood. People waved when they passed, sometimes stopping to chat, sometimes bringing pies or casseroles as thanks. The old barn's ruins were cleared, and plans began to build something new, something communal, a place for gatherings, a symbol of renewal. And though Charles accepted the kindness, he never sought recognition. He hadn't fought Karen for glory. He had fought because justice demanded it. But in the quiet moments, when the sun dipped low and the fields swayed in the breeze, Charles reflected on what had transpired. Karen hadn't just been an enemy, she had been a test of patience, of resolve, of whether justice could still prevail in a world often clouded by fear. She had underestimated him, mistaking his silence for weakness, his calm for passivity. But Charles Weston was not weak. He was not passive. He was a federal judge, feared not because of his power, but because of his principles. Because when people like Karen pushed too far, when arrogance burned too hot, he knew how to respond. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with fire-forged steel and the weight of the law. The neighborhood thrived. Seasons passed, crops grew tall again, and laughter returned to streets once patrolled by Karen's clipboard. Children rode bikes without fear of fines. Families decorated their homes without, bracing for letters of reprimand. The shadow that had hung over them was gone. And though Karen's name still lingered in whispered stories, cautionary tales told to newcomers, it no longer carried fear. It carried warning, a reminder of what happens when control becomes obsession, when power blinds a person to reason. One evening, as twilight fell, Charles walked the length of his property. He stopped at the site where the barn had once stood, now cleared and leveled. He ran his hand across the smooth ground, feeling not loss but possibility. Karen had tried to destroy him with fire, but from the ashes, he had built something stronger. The barn would rise again. The neighborhood would thrive, and Karen? She would fade into memory, her reign reduced to nothing more than a story neighbors told with shaking heads. Charles turned toward his farmhouse, the lights glowing warmly against the darkening sky. The war was over. The verdict had been delivered, and justice, as it always did in his hands, had prevailed.